Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local. All right, we're back once again for episode 38 of the Near Memo. I'm Greg with David and Mike, as always, and we're excited to be talking about the intersection of search, social, and commerce. I do it a little bit different every single time. Tons of news as always, and we struggle a little bit to pick three items, but we have three good stories to talk about today. And first is Mike highlighting an FTC report that focused on mobile ISPs in particular and data collection practices.
So the staff of the FTC put together a report that examined AT&T, Verizon, Charter, Comcast, T-Mobile, and Google Fiber, which represents 99% of mobile internet providers. And they noted that the consolidation of internet, cable, voice, content distribution, smart devices, advertising, web traffic knowledge, put these companies in a unique position to invade our privacy. And they note several conditions. One of the most interesting to me in the report, which is 70 pages long PDF, we'll provide the link. But
did you read the whole thing?
I'm about halfway through, but about halfway through. So I was working on it today. But one of the interesting ones I liked that I found intriguing, several ISPs in our study gather and use data in ways consumers do not expect and could cause them harm, in particular, browsing data, television viewing history, contents of email and search, data from connected devices, location information, and race and ethnicity data. And more concerning is data is used in ways that's harmful to consumers, including by property managers, bail bondsmen, bounty hunters, and for those that use it for discriminating purposes. And they note that these companies claim to offer outs, but they're illusory. They're not real. That you go to try to get out and either it's totally confusing or not at all visible. And they note that these guys, they're not as large as big advertising platforms, but the amount of data they have makes them a significant threat to most people's privacy. And they're largely unregulated by the current rules because they fall under the note of information service providers as opposed to telephone companies. So there's very loose or no regulation of them. And so the FTC is trying to carve out a way to regulate some of it along with the FCC.
Well, in California, they're subject to do not track, right? CCPA and do not track rules, or do not sell. Sorry, not do not track. Do not sell my information. But the challenge there is that all of those opt-out processes are very convoluted and buried typically. And so consumers don't go through the steps. They make it, they play hide the ball and they make it hard for people, but to opt out.
And they note that they don't always sell it. They sometimes give it away, which is not, or they share it as opposed to sell it.
That would be included. That's included. Any transfer of information, whether it's for money or not, is included. But the consumer is under a burden to trigger that. So if the consumer does nothing, then they're off the hook.
Although in a first party context, that's all those rules are off the table, right? So it could go from the television watching to the advertising group within that same company. And,
yes, that's true.
And they could be targeting you by race or whatever. I mean, so there's still huge privacy issues involved in this, and I think in some ways more dangerous than Facebook. I mean, I look at Facebook as, rookies compared to AT&T and Verizon.
Right. I would say the other thing is, Mike, you indicated that they try to sort of hide from or stay out of the visibility of sort of oversight, for these kinds of practices. And I would also say I would bet that their lobbying expenses rival Google's and Facebook's. So there's probably more Congress people in the pockets and, right, potentially other government officials in the pockets of these ISPs than any big tech lobbyist would dream of. So,
in fact, in 2015, it was agreed that they would become ruled under telecommunication rules. But they lobbied against it, and Congress finally overturned that in 2018. So they were once again fell under the information rules and thus were largely unregulated due to lobbying. I mean, it's clear that they're
lobbying is very, very effective in most cases. I mean, we can
even a higher ROI than AdWords.
That's right. exactly.
Now there's a
lobbying.
segue for you.
Yeah. All right. There we go. So moving on to our second item, which is mine. Snap released its Q3 earnings. I don't know what was it. Yes, was it yesterday that they came out?
I think it was
in the last.
Depends on when you're listening to the
yes,
memo.
that's right. Within the past recent period, ambiguously stated, Snap came out and said, its guidance was lower than expected, and it also sort of blamed Apple for the miss in the app tracking transparency. Its opt-in privacy rules impacted Snap more than expected, even though Snap CEO has been supportive generally of the rules, unlike in Facebook's case. So what's interesting to me there is that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, there was a report that appeared originally in the Washington Post in September, where a company called, I'm looking for the name of the company, a company called Lockdown, which is a privacy software company, did an investigation of a number of games, mobile games, on the iPhone, where people had not opted in to be tracked, and they found that fingerprinting was still going on. People were still collecting tons of data, and that data was being transmitted. And so the sort of high level message is that companies are ignoring consumer wishes that are being communicated through this opt-in process, and almost nothing conceivably has changed there. And TechDirt called it privacy theater, implying that it was a sort of more style than substance. But that seems to be contradicted by Snap's earnings, and I mean, Facebook will also give us an indication of how real this is. So I find that kind of juxtaposition interesting. If there's a fingerprinting going on where lots of data are being taken from a lot of sources, and still sort of circulated in this ecosystem, then why is it that Snap is suffering, and blaming Apple? And does this then portend, this is part of the larger measurement sort of conundrum that's going on in advertising right now, is it's getting difficult with the disappearance of cookies and with mobile privacy to kind of track people, and how is that going to impact ad spending in the future? There's a lot of discussion about that right now. So I just found the two things kind of interesting. Snap suffering a hit, and then a study saying, well, nothing has really changed.
Yeah, I wonder how much of the Snap hit is truly due to Apple, and how much is an easy scapegoat for the Wall Street story. Would be one thing. I think that at least in the I am full disclosure, I am not an active Snapchat user, but in the sort of in the cultural arc, it feels that Snapchat, to me anyway, has been sort of one-upped by TikTok as the cool, hip, new network, and that some of the other sort of mainstays are still as powerful in terms, Twitter, I feel like, Instagram, there's still very active usage on both of those platforms. We saw a rumor, I thought, this week that PayPal was going to buy Pinterest. So there must still be a fairly active user base on Pinterest. You just don't, to me, it feels like Snap has sort of lost some of its newness, potentially partly pandemic induced, and Apple may be a convenient scapegoat. I frankly, I doubt that Facebook's earnings are going to be hit to nearly the same extent that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So. I would agree with that. I think that you're right that some of it probably is Apple, and right now it's an easy thing to point to Apple and say, see, look at them, and we're not responsible. There's no structural problem here. The investment firm Piper Sandler did a teen survey. They do this teen survey every year. It's 10,000 teens, 16 years old. They've been doing it for a while, and I wrote it up in one of the previous newsletters. It may have even been on Monday this week. But what was interesting about it is I tend to agree with you that TikTok has sort of taken over as the cool network for people under 25 or 20, whatever. Snapchat was still the favorite network according to this survey of teens, and Instagram was the network that had the most time spent, I believe, even though it wasn't preferred network. TikTok was certainly up there, but I think in terms of the momentum, TikTok certainly has the momentum, and TikTok occupies the same place that Snap did for people. Even though Snap has some different features, I think that just sort of emotionally, psychologically, TikTok and Snap are more directly competitive than maybe some of the others.
Right. And I'd be interested to see that study run with a demographic that's at least 10 years older than 16-year-olds, because I don't think there's that many advertisers going after people with no disposable income. I think that the advertising world is probably more interested in the, Instagram stand-in demographic of, sort of 25 to 50 or so.
Yeah, and that's why Facebook, I think, remains so successful, even though it's sort of a middle-aged audience. That's where the disposable income is. That's where the discretionary spending is.
Although there were reports this week of Facebook feeling like it was an existential crisis, that they were not bringing young children and teenagers into their platform, and that they needed to develop a product to do so. There was that report. So they clearly see this audience as the future audience. And they, Snapchat and TikTok audiences mature. So to some extent, it's part of
which makes the $1 billion acquisition of Instagram an even better value, right? It's like they bought themselves a 10-year runway on demographics. So
yeah,
that's exactly right. I mean, they were talking about pipeline. That was the language.
Right.
That was being
pipeline.
used.
Yes.
Yeah. We have to maintain our. The
as
big
opposed
tobacco,
as opposed to whatever this is called, mainlining or whatever it's called.
Yeah, the big tobacco analogy, it gets more and more accurate. It seems every day. We've got to get our kids hooked on us. So, kind of shifting back to advertising, Rand Fishkin had a really fascinating post that is not a new critique of paid fill in the blank PPC media, questioning whether or not it's really delivering the value that people think it is. It's kind of there's sort of two arguments. One is that was raised in the early days of the internet is that ads are not online advertising is not getting enough credit for the value it's actually delivering. Display in particular was always the subject of that discussion. But Rand's argument is quite the opposite, that analytics are making us think that paid ads, performance advertising, is doing more than it actually is. And he gave a bunch of examples, companies that have cut their ad spending down to zero or
right.
Near
he
zero.
Highlighted Airbnb's CEO's statement saying that they took their ads to zero during the pandemic and they basically didn't see an impact. So.
Right, and Procter and Gamble has done those kinds of experiments in the past, and so it's an interesting. So take it away. I don't want to steal your thunder.
Yeah, no, that's okay. So I would say that there's a caveat for me anyway, that a lot of the companies that are typically used as examples of companies that can do this and not see an impact are very large brands already, and I think that there's sort of a need to get to a stage where your brand actually is sort of top of mind for consumers before this story is as effective as the one that Rand tells. But generally speaking, I think, the point is that because performance ads are so trackable, that CMOs and CXOs, the C-suite, loves them because they can tell a really tight story that, okay, we spent X dollars on these ads and they brought us Y revenue. And even though Rand's point is that in most cases, people probably would have bought the thing that they were going to buy without actually clicking on that last performance ad, particularly if it's a retargeting ad. That they're sort of, he used the analogy of a marketer, standing outside of a pizza parlor with a discount code and then taking credit for all the discount codes that got redeemed at the pizza parlor. So that you're just sort of you're cherry picking your customers who would have bought anyway because another channel was working better than your retargeting ads really are. So I think it's just an interesting thing to sort of keep in mind. I don't want to throw all performance advertising in this bucket. I think it still is hugely valuable to even try to build an audience and to build a customer base for smaller businesses. That said, the thing that struck me, there are a couple of things that struck me. There's been historically, there has been a huge underinvestment in SEO and other organic forms of marketing because they are not very trackable. And I think that that's partly where Rand is coming from with this. Now, it should be said he probably has a little bit of bias because he now runs an influencer marketing product, which is a little bit less trackable. But I think that was one of the things that stood out to me. The other thing is, as it relates to local, is this is where the specific ad unit of a local service ad really is so brilliant, because it's very hard to imagine that you have seen an ad for Joe the Plumber or been to Joe the Plumber's website before, and then, oh, it's actually, the last click on the LSA is what brought you to Joe. I don't think that that's a very realistic consumer journey. I think that the LSAs really are catching people who are in the, hey, I need this thing now, and this is the ad unit that is bringing me to this business. So I think it's just
and that's particularly true with Google including the LSA in the pack.
In the pack, exactly, right, where it's even a little less clear, what's paid and what's not. So I think again, it's just a really interesting article. I think it's a very timely article given all of the things that Greg you just mentioned, and something I hope people will at least sort of file away at the back of their minds as they're thinking about their marketing budgets moving forward and that sort of thing. Is I do think organic tends to get the short end of the stick, and that potentially we're spending a lot more money on ads that are preaching to the converted as opposed to actually evangelizing our products or services.
I think it's really challenging to tease all this apart. I think the point you made about brand equity or brand awareness is a really critical point, because these well-known brands that people shop for or buy from anyway are, you're getting a lot of sort of direct navigational searches to those brands. How many times have you, just out of laziness, done a search for a particular site or brand and then clicked on the ad because it was the top link, simply because it was an easy way to get to the, there's some percentage of that going on, but also people would buy from those brands anyway. Where it gets a little murkier is in your local scenario, where people don't know local brands. They don't, you want to build a fence or have somebody paint your bathroom. Unlike you, Mike, that has like a curated roster of home services companies, most people will just go and do a search and then do some review, investigation. And most of those searches are unbranded, not navigational, category based. And that's where the ads really do seem to matter. And they matter in part because the platforms like Facebook and Google have made it harder, notwithstanding the local pack, to get those organic results in the top slots. So I definitely think there's value for ads, but as you point out, David, the imprecision or the lack of trackability, if I can use that word, for organic is a challenge, because internally, when people are justifying budgets, they want to see KPIs, they want to see metrics that are mapped to ROI very, very directly.
There's even a conflict in the analytics. I mean, Google's interest is in showing last click attribution to the ad in their analytics product. And they do that a lot. So I think there's a conflict.
Rand did highlight the series from Avinash Kaushik on that sort of exact problem that GA has been historically trying to solve, trying to do a better job of. But yes, you're right. There is an inherent bias there.
But it's just interesting, because in the sort of zooming out to the larger kind of story of advertising and where advertising is now, ads are more expensive than they used to be. They're more competitive as more people are trying to market online, even than in the pre-COVID period, and you've got uncertainty about their efficacy. And it's motivating some people to try other things, to go back into traditional advertising. Out of home in particular is one that's seeing some benefit, although you can track that with mobile devices. So it's kind of part of a larger interesting story about what do we do now, where it's getting harder to track things and it's getting more expensive to buy ads, and yet we're compelled to buy ads because of competition, which is also driving prices up. And the lack of organic visibility in some of these platforms. It's kind of a perfect storm of challenges for many advertisers, especially small businesses.
sorry, I was muting myself. I do think that there's we're at a very interesting point in the sort of ad organic digital ecosystem. I think it's in some ways as interesting as the rise of Google in 2004 and 5, where I think that there is going to be real opportunity for creativity and for trying new things that hasn't necessarily existed, because it was, initially, SEO was so easy. It just worked. You just did it. Facebook ads were so cheap. They just worked. You just did it. And I think we're in a space now where everything is a lot harder and everything is a lot more expensive, and that there's room here for, it's harder just to run the same playbook over and over and over again and see success. And so I think that should excite people who are in marketing because of sort of creative reasons as opposed to just functional reasons.
Well, I mean that, connected TV is one area that's growing and where a lot of people are doing exploration. And then also obviously influencer marketing and TikTok is a sort of an extreme example of that. And one of the interesting things about influencer marketing, not to open another door, is that people are saying that the most effective influencers are not the celebrities, but they're sort of the tending toward the micro influencers, smaller people who have smaller number of followers but are perceived to be more credible, not sort of necessarily people who, Kim Kardashian and others that people have historically thought of as influencers. Okay, all right.
I think that's a very positive way to end the show.
Yes. I think your point about creativity is great, and hopefully people will do that. I mean, it opens the door for a lot of experimentation, creativity.
Yep.
Hopefully people will follow up and try things and so on and so forth. All right. So that brings us to the end of another fun-filled, fact-filled, satisfying episode of the Near Memo. Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.